Great. Hi, everybody, and happy Friday. Thanks so much for joining me for this webinar, the latest one in a series that I've been doing. I'm going to do one more in May before I take a little bit of a summer break. So if you have any requests for topics you'd like to see, feel free to shoot me an email because that's still in the planning. But I want to get started, and actually I'm going to turn on my video so that you can see me. I've been doing these webinars from behind a PowerPoint presentation for several months, so I wanted to turn that on for a second so that I can say hello. Anyway, here's a picture of me, but now that you can see me in real life, you don't really need this. The main things here are, here's my contact information, so if you want any more information about this, and I'm going to reference a bunch of other things that I've done and have up on the website, this is where you can find them at bemeasure.com. So I won't be covering things that I've already covered in other webinars. You can just kind of watch them yourself. So I wanted to talk a little bit before we get started about why you even pick this topic. I know I specialize in helping nonprofits and government organizations figure out, what they need to be measuring, set up all that tracking, and do the reporting and analysis that they need. And I've been getting a lot of requests lately. I originally got into this through marketing, helping places measure their marketing and fundraising, but I've been getting a lot of interest in reporting for grants and helping places figure out, what do we need to be tracking and reporting on in order to show that our grant is, of course, impactful, but, also having some great suggestions for, okay, we need to be looking at X, Y, and Z or focusing it in a certain way. To show that, this is insightful and we're being critical about what we're doing and we've really thought it through. And I think there's a lot of demand for this, because, grant administrators are people who are overseeing these, government contracts are asking for this, but a lot of times they're not very specific about what they're asking for. I know that I've been on the other side of this. When I worked in-house, we had a couple of grants, and I would get the person in charge of the grant coming to me afterwards and saying, like, oh, we just need some numbers to report on this to show that this was effective. And now, recently, a couple months ago, I went to a pre-proposal conference for this big government contract, and the person administrating that was saying, a big thing that we're looking for in the company, the nonprofit or the agency that we contract to do this work is reporting. But I, raised my hand and asked, okay, well, what does that look like? They said, we just want reports. We want it to be insightful. We want, metrics to show that you're measuring what you're doing, but they weren't able to really talk about what specifically that looks like. So I can see why a lot of organizations are very anxious about, we need to provide this, but we don't understand what we need to provide. So in putting together this presentation, I ended up deciding that I was going to focus on the three things that I really wish clients knew when they came to me about reporting for grants and getting that insightful data and analysis for that to report to their grant administrator. So I wanted to say that this ended up being not as technical as I anticipated it being, but I have a lot of other more technical presentations that are on my website. If you just go to bemeasure.com and then look under the other webinars, there's some more details about how to do some of this stuff. So otherwise we would be here all day long. All right, so the first point, so these were the three kind of big tips. And the first thing I want to go over, and I do hate when I join these webinars hoping for super insightful advice and they give me things that are really common sense, like please plan ahead. But even knowing that, I'm going to do it anyway. Please plan ahead. And the big reason for this is my slide that I show every time I do a Google Analytics training. It's showing, this is from Back to the Future. And I want to say that the big thing about data And one thing to keep in mind, even though it makes sense after I say it, is that there is no time machine here. So if there was something that you needed to start tracking from the beginning, say people are enrolling in a program, or there was something you needed to ask participants before they started said program, so you could have a baseline, you need to do that in advance. You cannot go back and get in your magic data time machine to go back to before your grant started. So it is super important that you convey to whoever is writing or in charge of these at your organization that you really need to think through your measurement strategy from the beginning. So it might be while you're applying, and certainly right after you get it. So before you do anything, really, you need to think about, okay, how are we going to track this? What information do we need right from the start here? Because unfortunately, you won't really be able to go back and get it later. And the more technical reasons for this, this is specifically speaking to Google Analytics. I work more on the quantitative side of data, though I do have some qualitative, so like survey answers information in here too. But speaking from the data collection view, if you're going to use Google Analytics, and that's what I use for my clients to collect information about what people are doing on your website or your social media or your email or any of these like digital platforms that you might be using as part of your grant, you're going to need to set that up in advance. And really the reason for this is that if you just take Google Analytics and you just stick it on your website, it's going to be really limited in what you can get. This was when I shared this story about how I used to, when I worked in-house, people would come to me and say like, oh, we need numbers to report on this project that we had funding for. And it's like, this was really all I could give to them, was just how many people how many views these pages got, how many people, we won't go into that, viewed them, and some information about like how they got to the site. But it's really limited compared to what you can get. And the reason for this is because Google Analytics actually launched, and we won't go into this in great detail, in 2005, and it took me a really long time to find this example. But this is, what websites used to look like in 2005. People, every time you wanted to see something new, you'd have to click and view a new page. And so a system based around views of pages and recording how many pages people viewed worked well back then. So being able to pull this this data in this way, I think it makes sense for these old-timey websites. Though today, this is often what websites look like. This was actually one of the projects I worked on to track a, not really a grant, but like a government funded program. And if you can see, this is all one web page. So if you want, and the organization did want to track like what people are doing on this site so that they can report to New York State government about what they're doing, this all needs to be set up in advance. This Google Analytics, like I said, was created back in 2005, and they didn't have websites that looked like this back then. So what you get out of the box with Google Analytics, these sorts of things, just doesn't track very well websites that look like this. So if you want to look at specific actions people are taking on your site, if you want some demographic information, if you want to see, specifically like, are they enrolling in this program? Are they subscribing to this email? Are they watching this video content? That all needs to be set up in advance. So that's my main point, is to kind of think through, out of your website or any other sort of digital properties that you have, what is it that you're going to be asking people to do? And if it's not just viewing content, if it's like taking some other sorts of actions, you're going to need to make sure you set that up all in advance. And this is a Cleveland Browns jersey that somebody has, I think, erased the name here in the back and changed it to next year. Anyway, my point with this is that I am from Cleveland originally, and I am a very marginal Browns fan. But pretty much the deal with the Browns is that they are so bad. They weren't that bad last year, but they're definitely not a great team. And pretty much by like the third or fourth game of the season, they've already lost, and people are already saying like, okay, we're going to get them next year. So the season isn't even over. It's not even halfway over, and people are already on to next time. And I see this happen a lot with grant funded projects. Is that we don't take the time to plan out things in advance, and already halfway through the project, we're just kind of setting up. We're figuring out the limitations of the data that we kind of got stuck with because we didn't think this through ahead of time, and are already my final report turns into pretty much like, here's the insights that we got, but next time we really should do X, Y, and Z at the very beginning so that we could get these better insights, and here's what we will get next time. So you want to try and avoid that sort of next time thinking. I mean, you don't want to have to deliver a report saying that, oh, well, we should have done these things, and here's the data that we're limited with, and here's what we should do next time. You want to make sure that you plan things in advance so that you can do them correctly from the beginning of the project. So don't be a next time person. Realize that you don't have a time machine to go back to the beginning of the project. Make sure you think about this and set this all up in advance so you really get the data that you need to evaluate your program. All right, next tip. So number 2 here is really deciding on an outcome. And I really love this picture because it is a photo of a belly flop. And I feel like a belly flop is a perfect analogy for what happens when you can't decide what to do. If you, you jump in the pool and you go for a dive, and then you're like, wait, the pool's not deep enough. I'm going to do a cannonball instead. You get sort of caught right in the middle of those actions and end up just like splashing down on your belly in a belly flop, which is very painful. So I think the same thing applies with analytics. If you are caught in this sort of mindset where, oh, we're going to do one thing. No, we're going to do another thing. I can't decide. We can't make a decision. You're going to, not really get the best of either world. You're going to get this sort of like, ouchie, stuck in the middle sort of sense. And I think this applies. I wanted to use an analogy here that I think a lot of people, myself included, are familiar with. When you're starting off a project and you have only a sort of vague idea of the goal. So I'm going to use getting in shape here for an example. So this is a goal that a lot of people have. The thing is that it means something different to almost everybody. I have a friend who came to visit me the other day, and she was complaining about her husband. He is, quote unquote, getting into shape by wanting to gain 15 pounds because he wants to, gain muscle. He's into weightlifting. She wants to get into shape by, losing weight and fitting into, clothes that she owned before. So this is one of these phrases that can mean one thing to one person and something different to somebody else. And really the problem with this is that it makes it very difficult to track. The metrics that you would use to track losing weight are going to be different and actually opposed to the metrics that you would use to track, gaining muscle or bulking up. In one hand, you're losing weight, in the other hand, you're gaining weight. So if you don't define what getting into shape means to you, you don't really have a good way to measure your success. This is also true with, web metrics. I have another presentation where I go into more detail about this, but just to keep it super basic for this, a lot of metrics that we use to measure campaigns, like traffic to a website and time on site for a website, are actually opposed to each other. typically when your web traffic goes up, so say, you're running a campaign to, let's see, increase awareness about energy consumption. If you're advertising a lot and growing traffic to that site a lot, you have a lot more people coming. They will actually be spending less time on the site in general, because these are new people who are less engaged with your message than people would be if you weren't trying to expand so quickly. So it's kind of like this sort of old-timey scales thing. When one goes up, the other goes down. So it's very important to really define what engagement or growth or expansion, these sorts of terms mean to you and your organization and as part of your program. One exercise I think that is really helpful here is this sort of Mad Libs. I like to use this as an example, that you're pretty much trying to just define who you're targeting and what you want them to do. And these are a couple examples from grants that I've just recently worked on. So we want this audience to do this action. And I think, everyone, if you're working on a program, should definitely be able to do this for your program. The harder part is what comes next. So for example, I'm working right now on a wrap-up report for a grant that's targeting parents of children under age 5. And the main thing they want them to do is they want them to work with their child on kindergarten readiness skills. Okay, so we're talking about who we're targeting and what action we want them to take. Another example here is that we want the example of that the website screenshot that I showed you before. We want people, living in flood-prone areas, right? This is specifically in New York, to take some actions on their property that they own, or work with their landlord to get certain changes done to their house. Okay? So all of this boils down to who do we want to reach and what do we want them to do? Cool. All right. Then I think if you're looking here at this action column, like these are all super great actions that you want people to take, working with your kindergarten age children. We want, people to take certain actions in as far as land conservation. However, the thing is, if you're looking at this and you're like, well, how on earth do I track that online? How on earth do I track that at all? I think this is a bit where the trick comes in. And this is why it's really important to think about this all in advance. Like, if you have a lot of people working on this, kind of defining this and turning this into actual actions on your site, can be difficult. So to go back to our, diet example, say, there were those two different options in my other slide. One was that you're going to lose weight. The other one was that you're going to, gain muscle. Like, okay, let's say we went with the losing weight option. This was your ultimate goal. If you're going to, this from a life skill, that you're going to translate that goal into concrete steps that you can both, measure and track for yourself. So you might decide that you're going to walk 10,000 steps a day, you're going to ride your bike to work, and you're going to eat a salad for lunch. Okay, so those are all very concrete things that you can do and know that you've done them, and they are things that you can measure. So you got 10,000 steps, 3 bikes a week, and 5 salads a week. Okay. So you want to do the same sort of process. Take that abstract goal around, okay, I want to get in shape. Okay, what specifically does that mean? Okay, it means I want to lose 15 pounds. Okay, so what specific steps do we need to take to achieve that? What are some actionable, measurable ways we can get to that outcome? You want to apply the same philosophy to your grant measurement. And I realized that the gap between achieving this outcome and what you can measure online are not always one-to-one. I mean, the same thing goes with any sort of diet, I'm sure, too. But honestly, because we are limited and you want your resources to go towards the content you're developing, or the program, the actual outreach, you want to make sure that these are as good of proxies as can be. And, sometimes it's just not perfect. But just another screenshot here. These were all from my other shot. This was all stuff that can be tracked. In this case, using Google Analytics as a way to look at, what are our steps? What are some digital conversions that we can look at online as we measure, as we can measure, whether we're making progress, towards that bigger goal that we have with our grant. Okay. And I promised some case studies here, so I wanted to give you like specific examples because I know this can be a bit abstract. So from my previous thing here was, we wanted to target people who have, kids under age 5 who weren't enrolled in daycare programs. We want them to work with their kids on kindergarten readiness. It's like, okay, what does that mean exactly? Well, it meant enrolling in this program, which is something that can be tracked, and also using this content, specific content that was picked out for them as part of this grant, and tracking how they get engaged with that content, and whether they stayed active in the program, and whether and how much they actually use this content. So all of that, those things were things that could be measured online. My next example here is from a totally different audience. This was the one that we wanted landowners to take specific conservation steps on their land. This was part of a larger project and a larger online tool that helped them kind of do that through sort of a project management sort of tool. It's a long story. I worked with the people who run that website to identify, okay, what are specific actions that we want people to take on this tool, to indicate goals, to, plan certain steps for themselves, such as, contacting a forester or, reaching out to someone to talk about, their will and passing that land along to their children. These were all specific things that were as part of this tool, and we could track whether they had used them or not, and kind of develop this workflow to see where were people moving along through the process. Again, this was all done through Google Analytics, and it was another thing where we kind of, you needed to plan this out ahead of time. Both, what do we want people to do on their land? How can we design a site that will help them, give them the resources they need to do this? And then also take a look at, okay, how do we track that and, use that data to figure out where people are in this process and kind of give them strategic nudges to move them to the next step. And then my last look, and this was a bit of a simpler project, is this program right here. It's a website called Flood Help NY, and it's specifically looking at people who are living in flood-prone areas of New York City. And, this is interesting because, it really is a hard ask here. They were looking for people to identify as living in these areas and then make an appointment to get an audit done on their home and make these the changes recommended in the audit. So the first part of the process is, all online, and people are able to first search for their address and then enroll in the audit program. And that was, tracking and looking at the steps involved in that process. That was also all done through Google Analytics. And we were able to tie that back to, how are they doing outreach? How are they kind of marketing this audit and seeing if that was effective or not. Cool. And then my last bit of information here, and I'm more than happy to take questions. I think we should have about 5 or 10 minutes for questions here at the end, is about Captain Planet. Actually, no, it's not. So I have, perhaps I'm dating myself here, but I was a big Captain Planet, the cartoon fan when I was a kid. And the gist of it, if you haven't ever seen the program, is that each of these kids had one special power ring that they would wear. It might be water or wind or fire. And the idea was that when they all came together and combined their powers, they, would, rather than just being, individual pieces of the puzzle, they would be able to work together to solve this crime and get, the idea is that independently, they weren't really able to tackle it. They needed to all come together to be able to handle this issue. So that's my point, is that data is great, but it does provide, especially, these numbers that we're talking about, they are, like the Captain Planet kids, just one piece of the puzzle. That I think it's important when you are doing reporting and your grant administrator is asking you, like, okay, we got numbers. What we really need are insights. An easy way to get that is to not just take the numbers, the quantitative, but also to take the qualitative information. So we're combining them in this sort of Captain Planet sort of way. So we got our numbers, and we're able to say stuff like, okay, we got this many visits to the website, and we got this many people enrolled in the program. And we're able to see, okay, people are dropping off or using this sort of content at this point. It's then through this sort of user feedback where you're able to say why that was happening. And I think it's important to know what you can get from each place. So you can combine your Captain Planet things. Cool. All right. So like I've said in here, a lot of this is focused on the quantitative data, and I use Google Analytics for all of this stuff. So what Google Analytics is great at, and that's all of my examples so far, is giving you actions. So it's going to tell you how many people were using something, how many people signed up for email or downloaded this or watched this video. It's all of the actions and it's all of the numbers. The thing that you can't get from Google Analytics is really the why. And this is another thing where I feel like perhaps this sounds obvious in retrospect, but I get this a lot from clients, people coming up and saying like, okay, well, I'll ask them for a final report, what do you want included? And it won't just be number stuff. It will be like, well, we want opinions about how we can improve this, or we want to know why this is happening. And this is not data that you can get from Google Analytics. This is stuff that you need to get from talking to your users. And I think it's really important that you realize this up front. So if you need that data, and I think it's great because it helps, like I said, round things out and tell a fuller story, you need to plan that ahead of time. And don't wait to the end report where you're pulling these numbers and you realize you don't have the kind of wide context that you want. So Google Analytics is great for tracking the what and the actions. And the way you could get this sort of why is on the qualitative side. So surveys and focus groups, user testing, these are all great ways, some more or less expensive or more or less time consuming than others. So, what you can, this was a screenshot of an online survey. I think this is a great, cheap, easy to use tool. This is a Google consumer survey. But you can also, I've worked on projects where they've done user interviews with actual, people who are participating in the program. That's a great way to get feedback too. And I'm not, that's not, the focus groups and that side of things isn't really so much my area. But I do want to make one big point here, is that I think the best way to combine the data with the opinions is to first start with the data and then move on to the opinions. And my point here is that if you've ever been through high school or college and you're a good friend, you've had that friend come and cry, this is my case, to you, or complain to you about, okay, he or she has a girlfriend or boyfriend, and he says he loves me, he says that he wants to be together, he says that he's my boyfriend, but his actions don't show that his actions, he is not calling, he is out cheating. You have a case here where what somebody is saying is not matching what they're doing. And in this case, I think any friend would advise their friend, okay, well, it's easy to say one thing, and it's, but it's harder to do that thing. That if you're in a case where you're trapped between listening to what somebody is saying and paying attention to what they're doing, you're going to pay attention to what they're doing. So my point here is that you want to consider what people say and take it into account, but the main thing you want to look at is what they're doing. And what they're doing is your quantitative Google Analytics data. So if you're seeing that people are, say, not signing up for this thing that you want them to, or that they are not using this content, or they're using this content over that content, I think it's good to look at these usage patterns. So these actions, it's what the bad boyfriend is doing, and then ask, use user interviews or these other qualitative ways to get feedback on why that's happening and what you can do to improve something or change something. So my point is basically, take your reporting and look at what's happening, and then use these other methods. It can be as easy as a survey or as easy as a couple user interviews to find out the why. Don't really start with the user opinions because people have this habit of telling you what they think that you want to hear, or what they think should be true. I was just speaking with somebody, not really related to client work, but who was saying that she had done a survey to ask a lot of people, actually as part of a grant, what sort of content they wanted to cover in the grant, and gotten one set of feedback. But then when she went and scheduled those programs, she found that people were not signing up for that. What they really wanted, what they really did, was something else entirely different. So I think it's good to first look at the what's happening and then find out why, rather than ask people their opinions up front and then try and reverse engineer it. So some quick examples here, as I know that we are running out of time fairly soon, is that, if you have a process kind of like that one that I showed in the flood help New York City example, where people were say they were dropping off at the third stage of the process. There was something going on there. Maybe they had to wait for a little bit of time to get some feedback, and they just never got back to where they needed to go. This would be a perfect place for you to ask them, get some insight into, what's happening and what are some improvements we can make at that point. Another example might be, we spent all this time developing this video content. We've noticed that a lot of the people, maybe are reading the articles, but they're not playing the videos. This is another point where you can get user feedback to figure out, what's happening here. Maybe they're not in a place where they can play videos, or maybe they don't have the bandwidth to download the videos. There can be a lot of different reasons here. You need that extra user insight to find out exactly what's happening. And the last thing here is, another thing might be, we're seeing that, a lot of usage happening during a certain time of day. This is what was happening with the kindergarten readiness grant around a certain type of day. Why is that? Is this a particular good time for you? How can we change our program to better adjust to your habits? These are questions that you need to ask your users that you're not going to be able to find out from Google Analytics. All right, so to quick recap, I have 3 big lessons here, is that you need to plan ahead. You need to define who you're targeting and what you want them to do. And then in a great Captain Planet way, you don't want to let your data stand alone. You want to make sure that you're combining both your numbers with your insights for a bigger, fuller picture. All right, we are unfortunately out of time. I'm going to get kicked off of Zoom here in a second. So there's my my contact information. If you have some more questions, unfortunately, I don't think we're going to have enough time to get to them. Please reach out to me. You have my website right there. Cool. All right. Hey, sorry. All right, Zoom kicked us off here, so this is the first time this has happened to me. All right, thanks so much, you guys. Have a great Friday, and feel free to email me if you have any follow-up questions. Great. Bye.